Today we're diving into one of the most iconic and misunderstood civilizations in history, namely ancient Sparta. From the legendary stand at Thermopylae and the fearsome warriors of 300, to the brutal training system and the enigmatic helots, Sparta has fascinated people for over 2,000 years. It's been held up as a model of discipline, courage, and military excellence, and sometimes as a cautionary tale of rigidity and decline. But who were the real Spartans? Behind the myth of unbreakable warriors and wit lies a far more complex story. A small Peloponnesian hamlet that rose to become the ancient world's premier superpower, only to see its dominance crumble in dramatic fashion. My guest today is Andrew Bayliss, Associate Professor in Greek History at the University of Birmingham and a leading expert on Sparta. In his latest book, Sparta, The Rise and Fall of an Ancient Superpower, he strips away centuries of legend, navigates the biases of ancient sources, and reveals the unique quirks, from its unusual double monarchy and powerful women to the constant shadow of helot revolts, that propelled Sparta's ascent and ultimately contributed to its downfall. We will explore how Sparta really worked, why it punched so far above its weight, what its victories and defeats can teach us about power, adaptability, and empire, and which popular myths it's finally time to retire. A quick word from our sponsors. Well, Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I have to always start with the obvious question. Why Sparta? Because this isn't like it just started with this book. No, like this is something that's like your life in a sense, right? Can you lead us to a young you and give me the journey to boom, this book coming out right now?
Well, there's two versions of me in this story. So one of them is when they created my job at the University of Birmingham, they decided, hey, we need to choose a module that's going to be interesting. So they created a module called Sparta. And it signed up 3 classes worth of students. So they were like, job done. And so when I got the job, when I was interviewed, they said, "Are you happy to teach on Sparta?" I was like, "Yeah." And having developed all of the teaching material, I thought, well, I might as well keep going with this. And then it just became my primary research. But the other version of me, who is the reason why I said yeah for Sparta, is I've always been interested in Sparta, even though I was researching Athens. Sparta has always been lurking in the background. And for me, it started when I was in high school. I was a 12-year-old kid. They introduced us to the ancient world. We had a session on Egypt. We had a session on Toland Man. And then they did Greece. And it was Athens and Sparta. And one of those weird quirks, we had a class debate and they just drew names out of a hat. And we got Sparta. And it was which city was better to live in, Athens or Sparta. And even though we got Sparta, we won.
It's interesting because you say, like you just mentioned this idea that you were into Athens. And do you feel like you betrayed Athens? I mean, because you're like, I was kind of into Athens, but now I'm all Sparta.
Well, I have a research colleague who I've known for years who compares me to Alcibiades. And he says, you started with Athens, you defected to Sparta. And he says, when are you going back to Athens?
Oh man, I was gonna say because there is a little bit of a dichotomy there. So there's a lot of misconceptions about Sparta, right? I mean, if you think about it, your book challenges this idea as like this timeless warrior utopia. That perhaps it wasn't just that. Can you think of anything while you were doing this research and even before the book that shows us maybe give us one major misconception about Sparta that people think of?
I think it depends what the starting point is, but I think most people of a particular generation have encountered 300, and I think they think Spartans are going to be loud and shouty, and I think. No, they actually were really big on silence, and they trained boys to sort of shut up and do what they were told. So I think this idea of loud, shouty Spartans is a really obvious myth.
There's none of that. This is Sparta. I had to say it.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't not.
I know. How often do you hear that when you're like, "Yeah, I'm writing a book about Sparta"? Someone's gonna say, "This is Sparta," right?
Everyone does this, and we were talking about this before we started. I've just been in Spain doing publicity for the Spanish translation of the book, and I was doing a pre-recorded radio show, and they said you have to put the headphones on, and so I put the headphones on, and they just played to introduce it. Gerard Butler shouting, "This is Sparta," with all of the music and everything. So you just get it all the time.
Oh man. So it's kind of tricky doing research on Sparta because so much of what we know about Sparta comes from outside sources, right? How did that make this tricky for you doing this research?
It makes it tricky because you have to find the tipping point that you're not happy with the source. So if you read stuff that was written until about the late 70s, it was just Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus says, and no thought about whether this might apply to something that was 700 years earlier, splicing all the sources together. So you don't want to do that, but you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater as well, because you don't know which Sparta Plutarch's actually writing about. Like it's really simplistic to just say, oh, he was writing the Roman period, nothing works, because Plutarch had read so many previous sources. So he's quoting Aristotle. So you're not going to say, well, Aristotle isn't telling us something reliable about Sparta. So you have to sort of start with the classical period sources, have your pinch of salt with some of what they're telling you, and then work out when you can bring in the later sources as well.
Yeah, and just trying to get around all this bias and bias that starts from the first sources about it. You know what I mean? Because not everyone likes Sparta when Sparta was around, right?
Yeah, exactly. So all of our non-Spartan sources, they've got an agenda of some kind. They might be favorable to Sparta. They might just think Sparta's a bit cool. That's how I tend to think that Herodotus thought of Sparta. They're the bad guy. They're dodgy. They're weird. So you're not getting an insider perspective. So there's always that sort of degree of distance, and then needing to think, well, what's the agenda here? Which axe are they trying to grind? Is this real, or is this an exaggeration?
So Sparta is often admired for its stability, you might say, right? I mean, it's the military, obviously, culture, but a stable military culture in that sense. But you dive into the fact that this stability was very costly and fragile, and it wasn't actually so stable. And on the surface, it might have looked perfect for what they were going for, but when you look underneath the sources and the layers, it's not necessarily as stable as it may seem. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it's their stability is propaganda, and they tricked the best into thinking that what they were saying was true. So we're often looking at Thucydides' claim that Sparta had been stable for 400 years, and you'd think he's a proper scientific historian. He knows what he's doing, and he's just bought their propaganda hook, line, and sinker. So their stability is much more recent, and it's pretty fragile. So their idea of presenting themselves as equals, it's masking severe wealth inequality. It's a game between themselves, and I think over time the cracks really start to appear quite quickly.
So one of the things is that there you kind of touched upon is there's this supposed equality among its citizens, but then you could also look at this idea that there's extreme inequality for everyone else, right? Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, so they call themselves the equals, and they're not, and they're just the tip of the pyramid in terms of the society that they are in control of. So Sparta's a city state. There's only a tiny fraction of the population are Spartan citizens who are controlling things. They have the underclass known as the perioikoi who are free, and we don't know exactly how many there were, but they do outnumber the Spartan citizens. And then beneath them, you have the slave class of the helots, who 75 to 150,000 adult men who do all of the work for the Spartans. So they call themselves as equals, spend their time hanging out with their fellow citizens, exercising in the gym, chatting, singing, dancing, dining every night, playing at being aristocratic gentlemen, and that's all built on a massive amount of slave labor.
And that's the interesting part here is that the majority of the population is slave labor. So it almost makes you question this idea: was this Spartan education system, military education system, was it designed to build warriors or more to maintain control over society? Right? Like,
Yeah, the long-term thought has often been that Sparta created it, sort of turned itself into a monster. So there was this idea that I think it was de Saint Croix compared them to Fafnir from Norse myth. Turned himself into a dragon to protect his stolen gold, and then couldn't enjoy his stolen gold because he was a dragon. And that makes sense to a certain level with Sparta, but increasingly we're coming to realize that this whole military training lifestyle is actually coming into place quite a long time after the conquest of Messenia and the enslavement of the helots. So it's not quite chicken and egg kind of thing. So I'm increasingly, and this is something I do try and bring out in the book, to look at what's going on in that time period. There's a lot of civil strife in general in ancient Greece, and Sparta seems to avoid that kind of revolutionary activity that takes place elsewhere, where kings get deposed and aristocrats get ousted and a more democratic constitution ends up in place. Sparta doesn't have that. And I think that's because they have this redrawing of the boundaries where the quite rich are allowed to be citizens alongside the very rich. And so they manage to sort of create a nasty club who hold on to power and then keep everyone else out.
wow. If you could drop the reader into one scene or one chapter in your book that you think would be like a perfect, taste of what the book's about, something that is like a cool moment. Think of like a trailer. You could drop a reader into boom on this page. What do you think? I mean, there's probably plenty of those, but can you think of one?
If we want just the Spartans are really interesting to know about, I actually want the person to start right at the very beginning in the prologue, because I told the story of the Battle of the Champions, which was supposedly that moment where Sparta introduces itself to the world and starts to become a proper power. But if you want the real Sparta, I'd actually choose chapter 9, which is the where I talk about how unequal Sparta is. And it's the conspiracy of Kynedon, an inferior who's been relegated from full Spartan citizenship, who plots to overthrow the state, and who thinks that all of the other underclasses will join him because they all hate the Spartans so much they'd eat them even raw, as the wording reading the informer who dobbed him in used. And I think that's Sparta perfectly in one little episode. Underclasses hate them. They're going to overthrow them, but actually, one of the underclasses dobs them in, and the Spartans deal with his conspiracy really quickly.
Wow. So this is one of these big, mysterious, perhaps not mysterious questions. When you talk about Sparta, I feel like Sparta always has three parts. You talk about Spartan, you talk about the enslavement, you talk about the military training is probably like the pinnacle of when you talk about Sparta, and then the last thing you always talk about Sparta is it just kind of fell apart. And like, why did it fall apart? What happened here? Right? Is there? I mean, a victory in the Peloponnesian War basically planted seeds of a decline. Right? This is a victory that like ultimately plants these seeds. But what happens to Sparta here? Why does it
Well,
go away?
well, I use the analogy in the book. I use a metaphor. So Sparta was probably simile, isn't it? Sparta was like a tree that was rotten on the inside, but still looked okay on the outside. And at the time they defeat the Athenians and reach their sort of the pinnacle of their power, the number of Spartan citizens has gone down massively. It's just no one's really seen it. It's not so obvious. So there were never enough Spartans to really be a proper dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean. But by the time they achieve their dominance, there's really not enough of them, because what was already not enough has become far, far, far too few. And they're not great leaders. They're not. There's a wonderful story when Lysander, who had defeated the Athenians. He was really the architect of the the defeat of the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War. The guy he's put in charge of a garrison controlling Athens complains to him about the fact that the Athenians are being disrespectful to him, and he says the problem with you is you don't know how to rule free men. And the Spartans, as a general principle, I think, did not know how to play nicely with other people because they thought they were better than everyone else. So they're not great leaders, and when there aren't enough of them, it's pretty easy for them to unite and ultimately take them down.
What do you think about the fact that they just, when you compare them to Athens, because you cannot compare them to Athens, Athens was almost cared about their posterity while they was all while they were building their civilization, whether it was through art, theater, other things. And Sparta was kind of like, yeah, no, we're not going to go into that. So do you think that the fact that they just didn't really care about, per se, leaving behind any mementos, if that's the right word, do you think that played a part at all, that they kind of phased themselves out of importance?
I think in a culture where increasingly the written words, great works of architecture is becoming the norm, Sparta is a bit of an outlier that way. They prioritize spoken word. There's a wonderful dialogue of Plato's where Hippias of Elis, notable thinker, complains to Socrates that he went to Sparta thinking they would want to hear what he had to say, and they just wanted to hear the stories of the origins of the gods and the great heroes. They didn't care about maths and science and discoveries. So they were steering in a particular direction, and I think of them as a group of people who were so convinced that they were better than everyone else that it never entered their head that they weren't.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about Sparta, definitely people romanticize it 100%. But what lesson or lessons should we not take from Sparta? Let's put it that way. It's a
I,
negative question, I guess.
I think if you start with the positive and then spin it, everyone thinks of the Spartans as freedom fighters, men who sacrificed themselves for the freedom of the Greeks. And yeah, at the Battle of Thermopylae, they were seeing this as a fight for freedom against impending Persian tyranny. It's kind of coincidence. Like the Spartans were interested in their personal freedom. So on that moment, it aligned with other people's interests. They went to war against the Athenians to liberate the other Greeks from Athenian tyranny, but really they were worried about Athenian power. So it's not being like them in that way. I think freedom should mean freedom for everyone, not just yourself.
Yeah. Um, and I guess my last major question: if a new major archaeological discovery about Sparta, happened, let's say, would be made tomorrow, what question would you most want that discovery to answer?
Oh, I'd love personally if there was a monument that you could uncover. I want the stoa that the Spartans set up after they defeated the Persians. Vitruvius and Pausanias both describe it. It had columns where the columns were made in the shape of statues of Mardonius and Artemisia, the Halicarnassan queen who fought against the Greeks at Salamis. I'd love that monument because we always say the Spartans didn't do art, they didn't spend money on these kind of things. They celebrated their victory over the Persians big time, and
Yeah,
I'd love to see that in all its glory.
that would be cool. Okay, so let me ask you this question. I've been asking this question a lot lately to whoever I speak to. Imagine there's a class at your university that's called Books That Matter, and every semester, 3 books are introduced, and students could take this class multiple semesters because every semester it's a different book. One of 3 books. You were asked by your dean to contribute 1 book to next semester's class to the 3 books that matter. Um, it's kind of a vague class in that sense, but you have a shot to shape the minds of the future. Young people, you have your pick. 1 book that matters. This is not the one that's going to be there forever, but it's for that semester. What do you give them?
I want Herodotus. Herodotus's histories, first historian, first ethnographer, first geographer. He matters. He tells the story of the Persian invasion of Greece, the Greek victory, but while telling us with absolute fascination about all of the different peoples who are involved in that story. It's not, oh, these foreigners are weird and bad. It's these foreigners are interesting. They have these practices. These practices help us to understand our own practices. It's an amazingly modern work while still having been written in the 5th century BC.
Isn't that amazing? Like, people don't change in a sense, right? Like, we
Yeah,
could still relate to something that's written thousands of years ago. It's
yeah,
nuts.
there's that wonderful story he has where Darius decides to sort of make a point, the Persian king, and he asks some Greeks if they would eat their dead, like he believes Indians did, and the Greeks are like horrified. And then to prove the point, he asks the Indians, "Would you cremate your dead like the Greeks do?" And they're horrified. And then Herodotus just says, "As Pindar said, custom is king of all." And it's just perfect. It's just a wonderful moment where a man so long ago just recognized, hey, we're all people, but we do different things, and what we think is normal, someone else thinks is totally weird.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew, congratulations on the book. I'll make sure I put all the links to it in the description. And thank you so much for the interview. This was really a great interview.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.